gotta come.
Otis Blue, Otis Redding Sings Soul is far and away the best Otis Redding album in my opinion. I don't think any soul album has captured the soul element like this one. What I mean by that is you can feel this music coming straight from the soul of Otis Redding. It's one of the most passionate albums ever recorded. It might not have the songwriting that a Songs in the Key of Life or What's Going On would have, but the incredible vocal performance is enough for me to consider it one of the best of the genre. Songs like My Girl and I've Been Loving You Too Long also show that Redding can be a great songwriter and writer, and when you add that to the powerful vocals that give off a sense of longing and loneliness and just a passionate love for somebody, it just makes this whole album awesome. Otis is a legend, and this is his best work. Free For All is one of Art Blakey's best albums and could easily be ranked in the top 3 or 5 in previous years. I've talked a lot about this dude. He's my favorite jazz drummer and just one of my favorite jazz artists in general, and this is just another album of his that shows why I love him. It has such raw energy and passion and focuses more on creating a good time than impressing you in a technical way. There's unbelievable drum solos all over the place, and Freddie Hubbard and Wayne Shorter highlight the great supporting cast. This album is even more manic and crazy than the average Blakey album. He basically just decided to go all out on this album, and it makes it super entertaining and fun. And just super impressive because Blakey is a crazy drummer, and he was in his prime here.
John is in the basement mixing up the medicine. I'm on the pavement thinking about the government.
Bringing It All Back Home is a classic Bob Dylan album that's often considered one of his best. It's not my personal favorite, but songs like Subterranean Homesick Blues and Mr. Tambourine Man are undeniably masterpieces. Talking about why Bob Dylan is good is something that has happened about 100 million times, maybe more. I mean, he's Bob Dylan. He's one of the best songwriters of all time, if not the best. He's a poet who made a massive impact during his time, and his themes are still relevant today. And this album is really just classic Bob Dylan, with a bit more of a surreal vibe to it. But really, this album is simply a showing of Dylan's incredible talent and songwriting abilities, and it's one of many albums that I'm going to be talking about from this dude during these videos, and I already talked about some of his already. And this isn't even the best one that came out this year from him. Volume 3, Dance of Death, and Other Plantation Favorites is another Fahey album that I just love. Fahey is a dude that I instantly connected with, and this album isn't his best, but it's still really good. Fahey's prime was during the mid to late 60s. His guitar skills were peaking, and his creativity and ability to create nostalgic atmospheres were also at an all-time best. He's the king of American primitivism for a reason. This isn't the best of his albums. The one he did in the year before was better, but it's still really damn good. It leans more on the country side, adding some old school styles to his guitar work even more than normal, but really this is just a really consistent American primitivism album that any fan of the genre should love, and a good beginner album for people who are trying to get into the genre. It just sounds so simple, and it always makes me happy. Wayne Shorter is one of my favorite saxophonists, and Juju was his best album. He's insanely talented, obviously, but the reason I love him is because he makes such positive music. A lot of times complexity and technicality is the selling point for a jazz album, but the biggest reason this album and his whole discography is great is because he focuses more on happy-sounding melodies that are sure to put you in a good mood. This album is my favorite of his because it shows more of Wayne improvising and showing off his talents, but I don't think that overlaps with the song structures because he doesn't make it the biggest part of the album. He still is creating uplifting and happy music. It just is a bit more impressive in a technical sense, and that's why it's my favorite of his, and the best way to get into his music as well. It's just so damn passionate. Grant Green peaked on Idle Moments, and so did jazz guitar in general. Green is one of my absolute favorite jazz artists, not just because he's an absolutely insane guitarist, but also just because he soothes me so much. His guitar makes me close my eyes and relax. It's a comforting and relaxing sound that I can't get enough of. This is his most technically impressive release, with insane improvisation and just mind-blowing solos all over the place. Joe Henderson, Bobby Hutcherson, Duke Pearson, Bob Cranshaw, and Al Harewood are all awesome on here as well, but when Grant Green just starts going and playing that damn guitar like a god, that's when this album is at its peak. This is some of the most mellow and calm jazz you're ever going to hear, and it's going to put you at peace if you love jazz guitar anywhere close to as much as I do.
Of all these friends and lovers, there is none.
Rubber Soul. I mean, like, it's Rubber Soul, obviously it's going to be here. It's the first Beatles album to be featured on these lists, and trust me, it's not going to be the last. It's actually probably my least favorite Beatles album from their run from 65 to 69, but it's still awesome, with classics like Norwegian Wood and In My Life. It changed music forever, and it started the Beatles' insane run where they changed music and just pop culture in general through their experimentation and genius songwriting. It's more tame compared to some later albums, but there's still weird-ass vocal melodies and instruments and production choices. This album has been praised to death, and the only thing holding it back from being top 3 is that I've never loved songs like The Word or Girl.
Wherever I have gone, the blues are all the same.
Jackson C. Frank is one of the most underrated artists of the 60s, and his self-titled album is one of the most underrated albums of all time. This album helped pioneer the lonely folk style of music that really got popularized by artists like Paul Simon, who was a massive Frank fan, and Neil Young, who I mean is Neil Young. He's like the best artist ever pretty much. Frank doesn't reach the heights of what he started on here, but damn, this shit is just so sad. It's not even beautiful. It's just straight up depressing in a disturbing and haunting way. Blues Run the Game is a classic folk song that has been covered by legends like Nick Drake and Simon & Garfunkel, and it's just one of many heart-wrenching tracks on here. The whole album is just about constant sadness that follows you wherever you go. Very few albums can capture the feeling of depression like this one does, and it hits even harder when you learn who made it. Frank was a very tortured man. He barely survived a school fire, which killed many of his classmates and left him scarred. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and depression later in his life, and his rapidly declining mental health led to his career being ruined and him being homeless until his unfortunate death, caused by pneumonia and being put in cardiac arrest. Learning about this man's tragic life makes this album an even heavier listen. It's guaranteed to fuck you up.
Like a complete unknown, like a rolling stone.
Highway 61 Revisited is the best Bob Dylan album by like a lot in my opinion. Yeah, it's basic, but this is the only album of his that clicks with me more than just on a songwriting level. What I mean by that is I always connect with his lyrics, but I often can't get into the musical part of things. But this is absolutely an exception where everything clicks for me. His vocals are at an all-time high, his guitar and harmonica playing is super impressive, and his melodies are his catchiest, especially on songs like Ballad of a Thin Man, Desolation Row, and of course his best song, Like a Rolling Stone. Everything just comes together perfectly from a lyrical standpoint and a musical sense. It's his most consistent album as well, with pretty much every song being great. This is his most accessible album, with it going in a more rock-based direction, and it's also his best in my eyes, as it was the only one of his that I truly came to love. You shouldn't be surprised that I Love Supreme is number 1 for me if you watch my previous videos. In fact, I said this was my favorite Coltrane album in my 1961 video, where I ranked my favorite things as my album of the year. But even in a more competitive 1965, I Love Supreme had to get my number 1 spot. This is probably my favorite jazz album. Coltrane is my favorite jazz artist, and I think his unbelievable and otherworldly talent was best utilized on this album. It's just so passionate and it's hypnotizing. This was his most spiritual album. It focused the most on creating a feeling in you, and it succeeded to an insane level. This album makes me feel like I'm in love. It creates more of a reaction in my heart than it does my ears. No jazz artist can do it like John when it comes to making you emotional, and he does it on all 3 tracks on this album, especially the second, which is my favorite. Coltrane speaks to your soul on a lot of his albums, but this one he speaks more to your heart, and that is something incredibly rare in music, especially the genre of jazz. If people doubt the power of instrumentation and pure passion in music, this album is the one most likely to change their minds. It's truly a life-changing album and one of the most impressive things any musician has ever created.